start talking about renting, change, etc., where discussions from this podium about the apple as an emblem of man's fall from grace. Am I the only one that have been thinking about renting change and realizing that this is the apple that most of the world now first associates with the word apple? That it has been a violent change in our perception of that emblem. And so for me, it's been a visual kind of back and forth during the discussion. I often wondered, I wish I could have asked Jobs if he chose it for that reason, because he struck me as a man capable of that kind of marvelous arrogance. Do I need to maximize this, or is just that going to put it up? What do I need to do? Do I just need to push it? Help. Yes, save me.
Where's the mouse? There we go.
The clock is ticking.
I think we're good.
Hello?
Is that switched over?
Yeah, you can see the mouse.
Okay, while they're fooling with this, I'll just start talking.
Sure.
There are two things that we came out of this project with. One is the belief that war is within us as human beings. It was the relentlessness of the repetition of the events that we had isolated in the exhibition across time, across culture, across faith, of repeated instances of each of these categories that we had established again and again and again and again, that really just left us with no other conclusion that it is something in us as human beings that seems to draw some segments of our species repeatedly to armed conflict. Another was, I don't think any of us can know what we would do in such situations. We can hope, we can train, we can try to develop courage, as Babette talked about, but in the interviews that we conducted, I don't think we can know. The other surprise for me in all the interviews that we conducted with combatants was that they may have entered a military engagement for God and country, but ultimately they were fighting for their comrades. They were fighting. Their courage came from the desire not to embarrass themselves in front of their comrades. Their will came from protecting their comrades. The bond, as Shakespeare called it, this band of brothers, is become so intense. What they go through together, what they experience, often becomes some kind of lifetime band, but certainly in that situation is a kind of defining parameter. One of the things that touched me when I went to the memorial for the Arizona in Pearl Harbor is how many men, anyone who was on the Arizona that day, December 7th, 1941, when they died, they may send their ashes back to be lowered into the Arizona. And the extraordinary list of people who have made that decision, particularly in latter years. So these are people who have lived 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 decades of another life, but still the place they want to be memorialized, to be buried, is there on the Arizona. That apocalyptic moment in their lives. And the third thing is that wars never end. There may be a date, there may be some signing of official papers, there may be a kind of cessation of active conflict, but in many ways it doesn't end. Now this affects different people. Okay, now I'm not advancing. Let's try the other button. No. So there is a kind of nostalgia that affects all of us regarding conflict, especially and primarily if we won that conflict. There's a big difference for the combatants who are in wars that are lost, are considered lost, versus combatants who are in wars that are considered won. And so a kind of nostalgia, memorialization, and celebration of those wars that are won becomes part of the culture, and photography is a big part of that, that phenomena. You know, back in the old days of carousels, when I once gave a lecture where the light bulb went out and they had no replacement. So I did the entire lecture going, now here you would see, so I'm going to start that. So here you would see a 50th anniversary memorial G.I. Joe doll with incorporated into the packaging of the box is a photograph by W. Gene Smith taken on Okinawa that was the cover of Life magazine. And so the box has both the Gene Smith photograph and a reproduction of the Life cover, which is indicative of the power of Life magazine during that time. The power of Life magazine. You all are all too young, but my family fought over Life magazine. Who got to it first on the day when it arrived? And it's a huge difference when you have one source of news, a newspaper, a magazine that's coming into the house. It was Life magazine, National Geographic. Every house I knew subscribed to both. Later, I actually remember getting a television. Whereas you all have different web sources, so there's no power of the media in quite that way now. One of the stories that I absolutely love, I was talking to my stepfather about newspapers, and he said his father was the only family member that read the newspaper, and he recounted to the family at night at dinner what the contents of the newspaper was. But for baseball scores, the boys were allowed, baseball scores came in on the telegraph, and they were posted in blackboards in the pool hall. And the only time the boys in this small Arkansas town were allowed in the pool hall is the boys all ran down the railroad track to the pool hall, which was across from the train station, and were allowed in the pool hall only those nights when there were baseball scores, and they could go in the pool hall and look at the baseball scores written on the blackboards, and then they would run home in the evening light. And I've loved that image of the transmission of information of a time lost. The next image that I would show you is the whole phenomena of military reenactments. It's huge. They are expecting 100,000 to 200,000 people to come to the sesquicentennial reenactment of Gettysburg this summer. And that's not including the combatants. That's just people to view the reenactment. My colleague, Will Michaels, who's on the co-curator, as I tell you, is a photographer, and he photographed the 60th reunion of the reenactment of Iwo Jima in Texas. They found a hill somewhere in Texas. We don't have a lot of hills. And they had 60 or 70 people come from Japan in authentic World War II uniforms to participate in the reenactment, and Will photographed it. And what I would have shown you is Will's photograph, totally informed by prior photography to the extent that he even put Timothy O'Sullivan. So you can see how he consciously put this out of focus in respect for the O'Sullivan Civil War photograph. But what I love about this is Clint Eastwood made those two movies about the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. And for the second movie, The Letters to My Father from the Japanese Man, they wanted a cover for the book. And so they called Will, and Will had a photograph from the reenactment of a Japanese person in a World War II uniform standing on this little hill looking out over the battlefield. And they wanted to put it on the cover of the book, and Will said, I like your terms, but you have to understand, this is fiction. And they said, this is Hollywood. So they didn't care if Will's photograph wasn't the real picture. So it's this cyclical thing of the power of photographs. So that's this sort of nostalgia. Now, the nostalgia can be intimate, like Peter Rysett photographed when they were cleaning out his grandparents' house. He found pushed back in one of the closets his grandfather's helmet and baton and belts and holster and everything. So that's a very personal kind of memorializing of conflicts past, a family memory. Next to it is a photograph made by two 19th century photographers of an Indian who I guess was renamed after the conflict. His name is Shot in the Eye. And it was part of a huge project that they did to photograph American Indians as the actual combatants of the American wars were dying. I'm sorry that this is cut off. This is a portrait with a tragic backstory. This is what happens to photographs. I talked to you earlier about how the meaning changes without anything about the photograph changing. This photograph was made after this man, between his Iraq and Afghanistan service. It says in the title that he served 353 days in Iraq and 205 days in Afghanistan. And the portrait photographer did this very powerful series of portraits where she asked the servicemen and women to lay their head down. She wanted something atypical that would jar us into spending a minute more. And she actually then had exhibitions where she put these up on billboards. And this was one of the sort of key images that when these projects were reviewed, it was reviewed. This young man came home. He used a GI Bill to go to college. He joined the Pont de Lac police service, and he was killed in a domestic violence call by another Iraq veteran. So then there's another aspect for the war, and I think I mentioned, well, I guess I mentioned it at lunch, that we gave anyone who went to our exhibition a 3x5 card, and eventually it filled 3 walls of these responses, and this was one of the things written on the cards. My dad came back from the war, my dad never came back from the war. And so one of the things that the last room of the exhibition was called Remembrance. One of the legacies of war is literally the physical scars, the things that this is a young man, a Hutu or a Tutsi who was attacked by the Hutus in Rwanda, where over 100,000, 200,000 people were killed in 100 days. During which the world did nothing. This is by the photographer Jim Goldberg, who his whole career has taken photographs and then given the photograph to the subject and let them write on it. And this is a rebel fighter from Liberia who actually drew this gun and the bullets that removed his leg. And this was part of a project where Jim went and interviewed these survivors, these veterans. Now, the PTSD, which I mentioned earlier, is a more tragic component. One, it's hard to identify. Two, it comes with a stigma. In World War I, England shot people who were shell-shocked, and actually only within the last decade has England apologized officially as a country to all the families of people who they shot simply because they had shell shock and they couldn't continue to fight. But they were regarded as cowards and killed. We're now trying to treat these young men and young women both who are coming home and having trouble functioning. I don't know if any of you saw the movie Hurt Locker, but there was a scene in it in which the soldier is home on leave and his wife asks him to go pick out a cereal. And he's confronted with this giant shelf of cereals and he can't choose. His life in combat has been so focused that the simple complexity of life is beyond him. That is common among people who have post-traumatic syndrome. Photographers who also, they've done the same things, they've seen the same things, they haven't killed people, but they've been in the midst of this. Many photographers have PTSD. And if they've gone, especially the incidence of developing PTSD develops proportionate to your number of tours or your extent in the conflict. This is a young man who has had a particularly difficult time because this photograph was taken during Fallujah, which was the bloodiest of our battles in Iraq. It was on the cover of hundreds and hundreds of newspapers and magazines. He was dubbed the Marlboro Man because he's smoking a Marlboro cigarette. The Marine made a poster boy out of him. He got proposals from women in the mail. He was lauded. Exactly a year after this picture was taken, he was honorably discharged from the Army with PTSD. And the public turned on him, and he got hate mail, and he was called a slacker and a fake. And now, even now, he's had trouble adjusting. He's had some drug problems. He had an arrest for drunk driving. And whenever anything like that happens to him, all of this comes back in the newspaper. He can't, it's difficult for him to return. It's difficult enough for him to return to an ordinary life, but because of this photograph, it's much more difficult. Now, I want to read for you, I guess, what is the official terminology of genocide. It is a coordinated plan of different actions aiming at the destruction of essential foundations of the life of national groups with the aim of annihilating the groups themselves and stripping all cultural traces of their identity. And I think pertinent to this discussion today that I wanted to get in that cultural identity. So in Rwanda, as in many other places, Bosnia and too many other places, the systematic rape of women is part of the new conduct of war. It's not new. I mean, the Rome goes there are many extraordinary, it goes back to ancient times, but there's a kind of strategy behind it now that is all the more disturbing. The Tutsi women are tall and quite beautiful, so they were easily identified and separated out from the Hutus. Many of the Hutu men had HIV, and part of the raping of them was giving them HIV, which it did. Also impregnating them so that they have a child of mixed race. So this woman is with her daughter that is by her husband, who was killed in front of her, and her daughter, who is the daughter of the rape. Many of those women either killed the child or aborted or died trying to self-abort. They are isolated from the culture. They are of neither tribe. Neither tribe wants them. They've been told by their tribal villages, you can come back, but don't bring your child. They have minimal means of subsistence. Some of them have gone into prostitution to support their children. A photographer, the man who took this picture, Jonathan Tagorvnik, has set up a foundation that has been helping many of these women, teaching them business practices. Someone gave them a goat. When he went back 6 months later, the income from that goat, now they had a cow and 2 more goats. But for the number of people that foundation can help, there are many, many more that are struggling, miserable, conflicted. They can't bond with the child. It's a horrible component of armed conflict that lives on long after. Grief. Literature is full of instances of mothers who lose a favorite son in combat and can't subsequently respond to the rest of the family. There are soldiers, Bosnia especially, there's a photograph in the exhibition of a man who comes home only to find out that his entire extended family has been killed. So he's there in front of the house and there's no one there. The civilian grief, the grief of loss of, this is collateral damage. This is a man who was killed by this military action that is justifiable because it's collateral damage. And grief can be a paralyzing force that lives on and from which some people never recover. And in fact, this photographer, Ashley Gilbertson, photographed bedrooms. This young woman was killed 10 years or 6 years ago, and her family haven't touched her bedroom. He found many families that have just left, have a in-house memorial to the ones that were killed. This is the photograph I pointed out to you earlier in my talk, and this photographer, during the disappeared, when the military government of Argentina was systematically killing a population mainly between 14 and 30, and they tried to capture him. He was shot but escaped and went to Spain, but they captured his brother, age 18, and killed his brother. And like many survivors, many soldiers, another residue of wars that don't end is soldiers can't get over why me. We know a man who was on the Cole, and the 2 men on either side of him died, and he didn't, and he still can't own that he's worthy of being the survivor when these 2 friends died. So how do you deal with that? Well, Marcello's way of dealing with this was to take his high school class photograph, first of all, circle the ones that were killed and that disappeared, the ones with the X's, and then write out which ones went to Israel or Spain or whatever happened to them. I was interviewing a woman in Argentina, and I was looking at her photographs, and her daughter was my age, and she was an esteemed older photographer. And they were of the intellectuals of Argentina, of Latin America, Marquez and people like that. And So I said to her daughter, you grew up in an intellectual household. And her daughter had been saying, that's the sculpture by this man and that's the painting by that man. And the daughter said, yeah, we used to have many books, but the police came and took them all. And then the mother said to me, and on the third visit, they took her husband. And I, at the time, was a recent widow, and so the thought of not knowing what happened to my husband, of having had no funeral, of having had no resolution, was incomprehensible to me. And then I was there to jury a competition, and there was a photograph of fish eggs on a beach, and I thought of Ansel Adams, very beautiful photograph, and the woman next to me shuddered, and I said, wait a minute, you're shuddering, and I'm thinking Ansel Adams, we're not seeing the same thing. And she said, during the disappeared, we all stopped eating fish because they threw people live out of the planes. So here was a whole population that were responding to this horrible thing that was going on in their culture by changing their diet. I will mention, by the way, they finally uncovered all the records, and the families, just in the last 10 years, have been able to get into these records and find out at what point their loved ones died, and even prosecute where names are associated with killings. They're prosecuting people, but it's 40, it's a long time later. Or the evisceration of a whole population, like the Jews of Europe. And so this is a photographer who tried to deal with that by finding photographs and historical situations of people who might have lived in that neighborhood and projecting the image on buildings that he knows to have been the homes of Jewish people during the war. Now, I want to end with an instance where art is being used for healing. It's an extraordinary story of a young woman who lives in Colombia. And Colombia has been racked with violence from a civil war, from paramilitary societies that started with the government and then broke off on their own, and drug wars, Escobar and others, all going on at the same time. She grew up, one of her earliest memories is her father putting on his vest every day, his bulletproof vest every day. She went to school with bodyguards her entire life during that period of the FARC in Colombia. And so she's done these two projects. I'm just going to focus on this one, where she interviewed women. One of the most hideous things that they did, all three, paramilitary, government, and drug lords, was make people watch the torturing and the killing of loved ones. And she was forced to watch them cut out her mother's tongue and gouge out her mother's eyes. And then, of course, her mother died. And so Erica has been having these women tell their stories and photograph them while they're telling their stories. Then she's made these really beautiful banners, giant banners, that she then hangs in. This exhibition is traveling around Colombia and is being hung in the churches primarily because the churches, this is in Medellin where there would be others, but these are in more local places where the church is the largest place in the village for them to hang them. And people are coming in, having the honor that she is paying to these women, having them have their stories told and honored, is having a healing effect. Other things are happening as well. The killers live among them. And so one of the women was talking about being in the exhibition one day and having the man who killed her son come in to see the exhibition. And these women are forming discussion groups to help them. Erica's project is uniting them in a healing process. So I wanted to focus on this with art, the capacity of art to be a healing process, and one of the things that we are most proud of in terms of our exhibition, something we didn't expect at all, is that veterans came and they came back again with their families, and in fact they asked for an evening when just veterans and their families could come, because they found that they could talk about their experiences, talking about the pictures, not talking about their experiences. And one of the things that I loved was seeing a Vietnam veteran, I did sort of tag along in earshot, go through the exhibition with his 2 grown sons. And when they got to a Vietnam picture, he would say, well, we didn't do it this way, and we had it. And it was clear to me that he hadn't talked to his sons about his experience. It's very common for veterans not to talk at all about their experiences. And another instance was where counselors would bring their counsel group to the museum. They would go through the exhibition, and then they would go back to the Veterans Center and have a counseling session. And apparently, of course, we weren't in any of these sessions, but apparently the soldiers, the pictures became an outlet for men to talk. There was a series of pictures that we had in the exhibition that were the 5 D-Day beaches. And there was a man that we knew who was not only day 1 Iwo Jima, he was hour 1. Going into Omaha Beach, which was the bloodiest of the 5 beaches of the D-Day invasion. And Max is one of those, hi, darling, how are you kind of people. But you asked Max about Normandy, and Max was like those flowers that you touch and they just curl up. Max would just fold in, and he wouldn't talk about it. So when I saw these 5 beautiful photographs, and I'm sorry I didn't put them in the exhibition for you to see, that are taken at dawn, they're elegiac, they're really beautiful, of the 5 beaches. I went to Max's granddaughters and I said, why don't you buy these in honor of your grandfather? And they did, and they were delighted. And then we brought Max up to the print room before the exhibition for him to see the pictures, and he started crying. Now, for us to see Max cry was very disturbing, because he's not the kind of man that cries, and we all thought maybe we'd done something wrong. We didn't know what to say. And finally, he stopped crying, and he said, this is so right. This is for the men that never left the beach. And I think that for Max, the granddaughters told me later that for Max it was a kind of settlement, that the pictures acted for him as a way, by this time Max is in his 80s, as a way for him to transfer his emotions into the pictures. And for these women, and I don't mean to dismiss the church, it is of course important to them that these were hung in the churches. I mean, they were hung because it's the center of the village, and because most of these women are religious, and it was important to Erica that the church, that the priest understood the power of this experience. And so I'm going to end early. Oh, I do have, oh good, I didn't realize I had this. That's the wall, that's not even taken at the end of the exhibition, but that's the wall of comment cards of people responding to the exhibition. We've never had anything like that, where people just gave this outpouring of responses, which ranged. My 2 favorite were 2 that were hanging together among many, was if only people with guns could come to the museum, and the card next to it said, I own guns and I'm a member of the museum. There were wars blamed on God, and lots of cards with arrows contradicting that. So there were dialogues between people. So I just want to, well, I'll end on this one. I think that the power of art, a power of art, can be healing. And considering the relentlessness of war, the out of normal experience, the opposite of bliss, whatever that theological extreme opposite of bliss is, that would be the wartime experience, that lives on, and that is, believe me, the fighting in Rwanda could be over, but it could erupt at any minute. The hatred is underlying and ever present. The same, I think, is true of Bosnia and other places. It's a festering of bitterness and that is tragic. So I think that we have to be careful of thinking about wars as something that ends. Thank you.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.